CD 8.
1991. Elliot and Angie have gotten involved in a complicated recipe for pancakes. A brilliant smile lights up the little girl's face. Her mouth is smeared with maple syrup. It's early evening. The air is warm. A beautiful orange light filters through the kitchen windows. The television next to the microwave is on, but the sound is off. A few blurry pictures of Kuwait, Operation Desert Storm, the first Allied military intervention against Iraq. On the radio, U2 is singing Mysterious Ways, and Angie keeps time with Bono, banging on the table with a wooden spoon. Elliot immortalizes the moment with his video camera. He always manages to spend the maximum amount of time with her, even at the expense of his career. He still loves his profession just as much, but he has rejected the compromises that would have allowed him to rise up the ranks more quickly. Others have overtaken him, and he's done nothing to catch up with them. Being a good surgeon in the eyes of his patients is enough to satisfy him. And besides, his daughter comes before everything else. He now understands his double and all the efforts he made to save Elena without sacrificing Angie. But the serenity he feels when he looks at his daughter is sometimes tinged with vague unease. Life has already taught him that moments of happiness can extract a heavy price, and he's learned the lesson well. Life has been sweet again for the last 6 years, but he knows that could end at any moment. The problem with happiness is that you get used to it so quickly. 1992. At 6, you lose your baby teeth. So Angie does her homework with a pretty, toothless smile, sitting at the glass table in the living room. Visibly angry, Elliot comes into the room and looks at his daughter severely. "I've told you before to turn off the television when you do your homework." "Why?" "Because to do good work you have to concentrate." "But I am concentrating." "Don't get smart with me." He picks up the remote from under a cushion and is about to turn off the set when his finger freezes on the button. On the screen, a reporter is speaking from Rio, where the Second Earth Summit is being held. For a few days, the great powers will talk about the state of the world's environment. The reporter is interviewing a representative of an NGO. For several minutes, this woman speaks knowledgeably and with conviction about climate change and the destruction of biodiversity. She has enormous melancholy eyes. As she speaks, her name appears on a banner at the right of the screen. Elena Cruz. "Daddy, why are you crying?" 1993. It's almost 6:30. Elliot slips out of bed before the alarm clock goes off. All that can be seen outside the covers is a head of long brown hair belonging to a flight attendant he met at the airport the night before, when he sent Angie to visit her mother in Italy for a few days. He leaves the bedroom without making a sound, takes a shower, and gets dressed quickly. He picks up a pad in the kitchen and is about to scribble a note when he realizes he's forgotten the girl's name. So he writes only the bare minimum. "When you leave, could you put the keys in the mailbox? Thanks for last night. Maybe I'll see you again one of these days." He knows it's pathetic, but that's the way it is. His affairs seldom last more than a week. It's by choice. He refuses to stay in a relationship if he's not in love. That would be hypocritical and cowardly. And, in a sense, that's the way he's found of being faithful to Elena. You make the best arrangements you can. He gulps down a cup of coffee, picks up a stale donut, and leaves for work. On the way out, he picks up the paper that's just been delivered. A huge photograph is spread over the front page. The handshake between Rabin and Arafat, under the attentive gaze of Bill Clinton. 1994. An early evening in late summer. The sky is mauve, with streaks of red. Elliot parks his faithful VW in front of Marina Green. He's arranged not to get home too late, but he knows that Teresa, the nanny he's hired to take care of his daughter, has already been gone for almost an hour. "Angie," he shouts when he opens the door, "I'm home." She's 8 now, but every time he leaves her alone, he can't help worrying. "Angie, are you all right?" He hears her light step coming down the stairs, but when he looks up, he sees her beautiful face bathed in tears. "What's going on, honey?" he asks, and rushes toward her. She falls into his arms, crushed by the greatest sorrow in the world. "It's Tramp," she says finally between sobs. "What did he do?" He's dead." He picks her up and carries her up to the bedroom. The old dog is indeed lying there on the rug as though he were asleep. "Will you take care of him?" the little girl asks. As Elliot feels for a pulse, Angie's sobs are accompanied by pleas. "Please cure him, Daddy! Cure him!" "He's dead, honey. He can't be cured." "Please, Daddy!" she screams and falls to her knees. He picks her up and takes her into her room. He was very old, you know. It's already a miracle he lived so long. But she's not yet prepared to hear this. For now the pain is too strong, and nothing can ease it. She lies down on her bed and buries her head in the pillow. Elliot sits by her side, doing the best to console her. Things will be better tomorrow. The next day they drive for more than an hour to the little forest in Inglewood, north of San Francisco. They pick an isolated spot not too far from a large tree, and Elliot digs a deep hole with a shovel he's brought along. Finally, he puts the body of the Labrador into the hole and covers it with earth. "Do you think there's a heaven for dogs?" the little girl asks. "I don't know," says Elliot, as he covers the grave with leaves and branches. "But if there is, Tramp will certainly be there." She silently nods, and then her tears start to flow again. Tramp has always been part of her world. "I can't believe I'll never see him again." "I know, honey. It's hard to lose someone you love. There's nothing harder in life." Elliot makes sure everything's done right. Then he suggests to his daughter, "You can say goodbye to him if you want." Angie steps toward the grave and says in a solemn voice, "Goodbye, Tramp. You were a great dog." "Yeah," Elliot agrees. "You were the best." Then they get into the car and head back to the city. They're both quiet on the way back. Since they deserve some comfort, Elliot suggests they stop at Starbucks. "Would you like a hot chocolate?" "Okay. With whipped cream." They sit down at a table and, with her face covered in whipped cream, Angie asks, "How did you get Tramp?" "I never told you?" "No." "Well, you see, at first we didn't like each other very much." 1995. "Daddy, can we see Toy Story?" "What's that?" 1996. "Daddy, can we see Romeo and Juliet? I adore Leonardo." "Did you finish your homework?" "Yes, I promise." 1997. A Saturday afternoon in December. For the first time, Angie has decided to go to the movies with her friends instead of with him. Like millions of adolescent girls, she couldn't wait to see DiCaprio kiss Kate Winslet on the deck of the Titanic. Feeling peaceful, Elliot makes some coffee in the kitchen. Everything is fine. So why does he have this deep
goes upstairs
feeling and opens the door to Angie's room? She's left the music on. The Spice Girls are belting out their hit Wannabe on the stereo. On the wall next to the ever-present Simpsons hang posters from television shows he's never heard of. Friends, Beverly Hills 90210, South Park. He feels an abrupt emptiness, realizing suddenly that his daughter is no longer really a child. That's normal. Kids grow up. That's life. But why so fast? 1998. Elliot is 52. The television is on in the hospital break room. On the screen, some guy is saying that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. All the nurses in the room seem to agree. Elliot frowns. More and more often, he has the impression that he's out of sync with the world around him. He finishes his can of Coke and leaves the room. For the first time, he feels the burden of being over 50. It's not that he feels old, but he no longer feels young. And he knows his youth will never return. The hit show on television is ER. Some patients in the hospital ask to be treated by Dr. Green or Dr. Ross. One Thursday in January, the gloomy face of Bill Clinton, forced to defend himself, appears on television. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. At the same time, north of the Arctic Circle, the ice keeps on melting because of global warming. But who really cares? 1999. It's the end of April. Elliot pokes his head into the break room. Empty. He opens the little refrigerator to take out a piece of fruit. A nurse has stuck a Post-it with her name on a green apple. Elliot raises his eyebrows, takes off the note, and bites into the apple. He sits on the windowsill and distractedly watches some of his colleagues playing basketball outside. The scent of spring is floating through San Francisco. Today is a perfect day, a day worth living, when all operations are successful and no patient is inconsiderate enough to slip through his fingers. He hesitates to turn on the television. Why take the risk of ruining this good mood by inflicting on himself his daily dose of bad news? He's about to leave it off when he tells himself that maybe today things will be different. He starts to daydream for a minute. The announcement of a vaccine against AIDS, permanent peace in the Middle East, a real global plan to fight pollution, doubling of the federal education budget. Bad guess. A special correspondent on CNN, speaking from Columbine High School in Littleton, is explaining that 2 students have just shot 12 of their fellows before turning the weapons on themselves. He should have left it off. 2000. Daddy, can I get a piercing? Daddy, can I have a cell phone? Daddy, can I get a tattoo? But also a gerbil, an iMac, an iPod, a DKNY t-shirt, diesel jeans, a fur bag, New Balance sneakers, a clownfish, a Burberry raincoat, Marc Jacobs perfume, D&G glasses, a chinchilla, a Hello Kitty bag, turtles, a Tommy Hilfiger polo shirt, an IKKS t-shirt, a seahorse, a Ralph Lauren sweater, a... 2001. Elliot parks his VW in the lot and glances at his watch. It's still early. Theoretically, he doesn't start work for 2 hours, but he's decided to come in early. He knows today will be a special day. When he comes into the hospital lobby, he sees dozens of patients, doctors, and nurses crowded around the television set. They all look pale, and many of them have their cell phones out. Of all the things his double told him in their various encounters in 1976, there's one he's never forgotten. Something happened on September 11th, 2001 at the World Trade Center. Elliot has been wondering for a long time what that something could be. He gets closer to the television and pushes his way through a few people to get a glimpse of the screen. Now he knows. 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. Elliot is 56, 57, 58, 59. It's not that we have little time, but more that we waste a good deal of it. Seneca. 2006. Elliot is 60. Manhattan, the second week in January. Elliot has taken a few days' vacation to help Angie get settled in New York, where she's about to begin medical school. His daughter is all excited by her new life, and Elliot has left her for a few hours to make a rather special trip. The taxi drops him off in front of a glass and metal tower at the corner of Park Avenue and 52nd Street. He goes into the building and takes the elevator to the 33rd floor, the offices of a prominent medical practice. The day before, he went through a whole battery of tests and scans, and now he's come for the results. Elliot decided to have all these tests done in New York instead of San Francisco, where half the doctors in town know him. In theory, of course, there is such a thing as medical confidentiality, but in this world, as in others, rumors spread fast. "Please, come in, Elliot," says John Goodwin, one of the doctors in the practice. The two men went to medical school together in California, and they've kept in touch. Elliot sits in a chair as Goldwyn opens a file and takes out several X-rays that he spreads out on his desk. "I won't lie to you, Elliot," he says, and hands him one of the pictures. "I have cancer, don't I?" "Yes." "Is it serious?" "I'm afraid so." He takes a few seconds to digest the information, then says, "How much time?" "A few months." 15 minutes later, Elliot is on the street again, amid the skyscrapers, the car horns, and the traffic. The sky is blue, but it's icy cold. Still stunned from learning of his disease, he wanders through Manhattan, lost, feverish, shaking. As he walks through a shopping mall, he comes face to face with his mirror image in the window of a luxury shop. Suddenly he sees that he has the same age and the same appearance as his double, who appeared to him 30 years before. That's it. I've finally become him. Looking at his reflection in the window, he waves the X-ray of his cancerous lungs. As though he could still speak to his double across time, he says in a choked voice, "That's something you made sure not to tell me, you bastard!" Chapter 22. And leaving me to my fate, he went out into the light-filled morning. Edith Piaf. February 2007. Elliot is 61. 3 minutes before death. Wrapped in blankets and stretched out on the couch on the veranda, Elliot is watching the sun set on San Francisco for the last time. He is shivering, and even with the oxygen mask he can no longer breathe. He feels as though his entire body is on the point of dissolving. 2 minutes before death. The dreaded moment has finally come. The moment when he embarks on the great journey. It is often said that the value of a life comes not from how long it lasts, but from the way it is lived. Easy to say when you're the picture of health. Elliot believes he's tried his best. But in the end, has he done well? Only time will tell. Only death will tell. He would have liked to die with the serenity of a Zen master. But it's not that easy. In fact, he's helpless like a kid. He's afraid. He didn't want to tell Angie. He has no one by his side. So that he won't leave this life entirely alone, he thinks very hard about Elena. And at the moment he breathes his last breath, he manages to convince himself that she is by his side. Chapter 23. It's human to have a secret, but it's just as human to reveal it sooner or later. Philip Roth. February 2007, 3 days later. Bright winter sunlight was shining on the verdant walks of Greenwood Cemetery, making it look like a park. The burial had just taken place, and people who wanted to say a last goodbye to Elliot walked past his grave and tossed a handful of dirt or a flower onto the coffin. Angie came forward first, along with her mother, who had come from Milan. Then came his colleagues and many of the patients he had operated on in the last 30 years. If he hadn't been 6 feet under, Elliot would have been surprised and touched by the crowd. The presence of one person in particular would have warmed his heart. The retired Detective Malden, who was over 90, and who came valiantly forward, supported by his old colleague, Captain Douglas, now in charge of the city police. The ceremony ended a half-hour later, just before nightfall. Everyone quickly scattered to the parking lot and the familiar comfort of their cars. When they arrived home, many of them thought, "My day will come too." And immediately afterward, "I hope it's as late as possible." The windswept little cemetery was now deserted. When he was sure he was alone, a man who had stood apart during the ceremony finally ventured to approach the grave. Matt. Tiffany had tried to dissuade him from coming. She saw no need to honor the memory of a man who hadn't spoken to him for 30 years. But Matt had come all the same. With Elliot's death, a whole period of his youth had disappeared, along with the hope of reconciliation that he'd always secretly nourished. For Matt couldn't help thinking that he'd missed something essential 30 years ago. What was the explanation for Elliot's sudden change in behavior toward him? How could he possibly have left Elena when they were so much in love? These were all questions he would never be able to answer now. "You decided to take your secrets with you, old pal," he said helplessly. As he stood before the newly erected gravestone, memories rushed through his mind. And they were painful. They had once been so close. Even though the end of their friendship was 30 years ago, to him it seemed like yesterday. Matt crouched in front of the gravestone and remained motionless for a good while as his silent tears fell on the ground. As he grew older, tears would sometimes come from nowhere, and he could do nothing to stop them. As he got up, he said with a kind of ironic anger, "Since you went first, you'd better keep that damn spot in heaven for me." He was about to walk off when he felt a presence behind him. "You must be Matt." He turned around, surprised by a voice he had never heard before. A young woman in a long black coat was standing before him. "I'm Angie, Elliot's daughter," she said, and held out her hand. "Matt DeLuca." He introduced himself. "My father told me that at his funeral, you would be the one who stayed the longest at his grave." "We were friends," Matt explained, almost embarrassed. "Very close friends." He let his words hang in the air for a few seconds, and then explained, "But it was a long time ago. Well before you were born." At the young woman, Matt couldn't help being troubled by her resemblance to Elliot. Angie had inherited her father's regular features, but not his anxious expression. She was a radiantly beautiful young woman who, despite her sadness, seemed at ease with herself. "My father left this for you," she said, handing him a brown paper bag. "Oh," he said in surprise as he took it. Angie hesitated, and then went on. "A few weeks before he died, he told me that if something serious ever happened to me—" "Yes?" said Matt, to encourage her to continue. "If I had a problem, I shouldn't hesitate to come to you." Touched and comforted by this mark of trust, Matt took a moment before saying, "Of course. I'll do whatever I can to help you." "Maybe we'll meet again soon," she said, and moved off like a shadow. Matt waited until he'd lost sight of her and turned back to Elliot's grave. "You can count on me," he promised. "I'll look after her." Then he left the cemetery, his heart a little less heavy than when he'd arrived. His eyes glistening, Matt was on Route 29 headed for Calistoga, the little Napa Valley town where his vineyard was located. Tiffany was in Europe promoting their wine, and he didn't want to go back to a cold and empty house in San Francisco. He drove through Oakville and St. Helena on the way to the property that was his pride and joy. Matt was a rich man. For 30 years he had spared no efforts to make his vineyard one of the most highly rated in the region. He pressed a button on the remote, and the gates of the winery opened. He drove past gardens with ornamental fountains and parked his car at the end of a gravel driveway. The old wooden house had been torn down long ago and replaced by a handsome building that was both classic and contemporary. He greeted the watchman and went directly down to the tasting cellar. It was a huge room, decorated with paintings and sculptures by renowned artists: Fernand Léger, Dubuffet, César, and a priceless Basquiat he'd given Tiffany for her last birthday. The light was soft, lending the floor a rich bronze color. Matt sat down on an oak bench and eagerly opened up the paper bag, curious to see what his friend might have bequeathed to him. Inside was a wooden box containing 2 bottles of wine that he examined carefully. Chateau Latour, 1959, Chateau Mouton Rothschild, 1982. Splendid vintages for 2 of the finest wines in the Médoc. A kind of perfection in this fallen world. Matt smiled ruefully as he picked up a bottle and was surprised to find a large leather notebook stuck at the bottom of the box. In an instant, his mood shifted from amusement to surprise and then to excitement, and his hands shook as he opened the notebook. It had about 100 pages covered with neat handwriting that he recognized as Elliot's. As he glanced over the first page, Matt felt his skin prickle. "My dear Matt, if you're reading these lines, that means that the damn cancer finally got the best of me. I fought it to the bitter end, but there are enemies you can't beat. You probably saw my obituary in yesterday's paper, and since you're good-hearted, you figured out a way to get to my funeral. I even bet you hid behind a tree until you could have a quiet conversation with my gravestone. I know you're still mad at me. I know you never understood my behavior and you suffered the way I suffered. I would have liked to explain things sooner, but that was impossible. You'll understand why. So here's the incredible adventure that I fell into and that affected all of us. You, Elena, and me. I tried every time to make the right decision, but as you'll see, my room for maneuver was limited. Once you've read these pages, please, above all, don't blame yourself for anything. You were always there for me, and I was tremendously lucky to have you for a friend. Before starting to read, open one of the bottles of wine. You see how highly I thought of you? Pour a glass and drink a toast to me." As I write these lines, I know I'm living my final days. The bay window of my bedroom is open. The sky is glowing with that intense blue that you see only in California. A few puffy clouds are scudding by, and the wind carries the sound of the waves. All the little things we never take the time to appreciate. It sounds stupid to say it, but it's so hard to leave them. Take care of yourself, Matt, and take advantage of the time you have left. If you only knew how much I've missed you. Your friend in life and death, Elliot. It was past 2 a.m. Matt's eyes were red when he'd finished reading the astonishing tale his friend had left for him. Elliot's encounter with his double, the time travel, the strange pact to save Elena. The story that he hadn't wanted to believe 30 years ago came back to him today in a different light. Matt closed the notebook and stood up with difficulty. His head was spinning, and he'd made a good dent in the bottle of Latour. But that had not been enough to obliterate the enormous pain of his remorse and regrets. What should he do now? Kill the bottle to drown his sorrows? He considered the idea for a minute, but quickly dismissed it. He went behind the tasting counter and splashed his face with cold water. Then he put on his coat and went out into the dark. A few gusts of the icy wind were enough to sober him up. Elliot was dead, and he couldn't do anything to change that. But there was still one thing he could do. But did he have the right? Instead of his sports car, he got into the 4-wheel drive belonging to the business. As he left the property, he turned on the GPS system and entered an address in Northern California. Then he headed for the mountains. He drove through the night, heading west through snow-covered country. It was still winter, and the roads were slippery and obscured by thick fog. He almost ran out of gas a little past Willow Creek, and was saved only by a drugstore owner who agreed to sell him a containerful for a king's ransom. When he got to Weaverville, the fog had finally lifted, and he could see the sun peeking over the snowy caps of the Trinity Alps. He took the forest road, and soon came to the little wooden house that he'd already visited with Tiffany. Hearing the noise of the car, Elena had come out onto the porch. "Matt!" she cried, in a worried voice. He waved and joined her on the porch, giving her a big hug. Every time he looked at her, he felt distinctive emotion, a mixture of compassion and respect. Elena had fought all her life, first to overcome her handicap, and then to defend the causes dear to her. "You're looking good," he said. "You, on the other hand, look like hell. What happened, Matt?" "I'll explain. But first, make me some coffee." He followed her into the house. The cottage was tastefully decorated with a mixture of traditional wood and designer furniture, bay windows, a fireplace, the latest computer equipment. Nothing was lacking to make the place cozy and comfortable. "Well?" Elena asked and turned on the espresso machine. "Your wife kick you out?" "Not yet," answered Matt, with a hint of a smile. He looked at her tenderly. Despite the ordeal she'd gone through, Elena still exuded an amazing charm. At Stanford, where she taught a few courses, she was considered one of the stars of the campus. In that nursery of intellectuals and Nobel Prize winners, more than a few brilliant men had been given a gentle brush-off when they tried some strategy of seduction on her. Matt knew that Elena had given up any love life after her accident. In the hospital, she'd fought to survive repeated surgical procedures. In Greenpeace, she'd worked tirelessly against lobbies and governments. But she'd never tried to find love again, she said, and set down a tray with 2 steaming cups and an assortment of cookies. A cat with long, silky hair entered the room to ask for his first meal of the day, too. Elena picked him up and petted him for a little while. She was about to go back to the kitchen when Matt suddenly confessed the reason for his visit. Elliot is dead. Deep silence filled the house. Elena dropped the Persian cat, who landed with a complaining meow. "Cigarettes?" she asked, turning back toward Matt. "Yes. Lung cancer." She nodded pensively. Her face was impassive, but Matt noticed that her eyes were glistening. Then she headed for the kitchen with the cat at her heels. Left alone, Matt sighed. His eyes wandered to the glaciers coming down the mountains like frozen lava flows. Suddenly, the whole house was shaken by the noise of breaking dishes. He ran into the kitchen and found Elena collapsed on a chair. With her head in her hands, she was giving free rein to her sorrow. Matt kneeled down next to his friend and hugged her with all the affection that was in him. "I loved him so much," she confessed, her face on his shoulder. "Me too." She looked up at him, her eyes full of tears. "In spite of everything he did to us, I kept on loving him." "There's something you need to know," Matt whispered. He stood up and took the large notebook out of his coat pocket. "Elliot left me this before he died," he explained, and handed it to Elena. She took the notebook with shaking hands. "What is it?" "The truth," he said simply. Then he left the house and got back into his car. Puzzled, Elena went out onto the porch to try to stop him leaving, but Matt had already gone. The morning air was chilly in spite of the sun. Elena picked up a shawl and covered her shoulders before settling into the rocking chair. She opened the leather notebook, immediately recognized Elliot's handwriting, and felt as though an ice pick was plunging into her heart and lacerating her soul. After reading the first lines, she understood she was finally going to get the answer to the question that had made her suffer for 30 years. Why did you abandon me? Matt drove like an automaton toward San Francisco, sad and downcast. Elliot's confession had at first given him some comfort, but that soon gave way to melancholy, and then depression. In fact, this posthumous reconciliation gave him a feeling of things left. Matt had an Epicurean side. What he believed in was life. A good death, the ideas of leaving in peace, of drawing up a positive balance sheet for his life, all left him cold. What he would have liked to do was relive their glory days. Get in the boat and sail around the bay. Have a drink in a cafe in the old port. Eat a trout Chez Francis. Go for a hike in the Sierra Nevada forest. Live. But he shouldn't give way to dreams. Elliot was dead, and his own turn might come soon. Naively, he had always imagined that everything between them would work out. But life had decided differently, and the years of estrangement had passed by. It was now 3 in the afternoon. As he drew closer to the city, traffic got heavier. He stopped at a gas station to fill up and to get something to eat. In the restroom, he threw water on his face several times, as though he expected that would wash away his weariness and his age. The mirror reflected a dismal picture. His stomach was rumbling, and his mind was clouded by exhaustion and depression. Why did he have the troubling feeling that he was missing something essential? Something that had been tormenting him since the night before. The circle didn't seem quite complete. But he ordered a sandwich and sat down at a table by the window, looking out distractedly at the heavy traffic on Route 101. He felt guilty biting into his BLT. Since his latest tests had shown an alarming cholesterol level, his wife had forbidden him to eat bacon. But today Tiffany wasn't there to take care of him. Unbidden, between bites, he took the bottle of anti-cholesterol medicine out of his jacket pocket where he always kept it. The bottle was almost empty. He took the last capsule and washed it down with a swig of coffee. This mechanical procedure made something click in his head. He left his sandwich behind and hurried back to his car, because he had just understood what had been bothering him for the last few hours. He had read and reread Elliot's story. It explained clearly that the old Cambodian had given him 10 pills. But Elliot had made only 9 journeys through time. 10 pills, 9 journeys. What had happened to the remaining pill? Chapter 24. Last Pill. When several roads are offered to you, and you don't know which one to choose, don't take one at random, but sit and wait. Keep on waiting. Don't move. Keep silent, and listen to your heart. Then, when it speaks to you, get up and follow where it leads. Susanna Tomorrow. 2007. Matt is 61. Matt got back to town in less than half an hour. Something was running through his head. The idea was a little crazy, but it eased his heartache. He roared onto Marina Boulevard and, as in the good old days, parked his car in front of Elliot's house. He'd hoped to find Angie there, but apparently the house was empty. After ringing the bell and pounding on the door, he went around the house and climbed over the fence into the garden. The place was virtually unchanged. The old Alaska cedar still stood there. Its branches had spread by now to meet the glass wall. Matt was almost certain that, unlike the other houses in the neighborhood, this one didn't have an alarm system. He took off his coat, rolled it up around his arm, and, with all his strength, jabbed one elbow into the bay window in the kitchen. The glass was thick, but Matt still had impressive physical strength. When the window gave, he slipped his hand between the shards and opened the door from the inside. He crept into the house, and for 3 long hours went through the place from top to bottom, methodically searching every room, opening all the drawers, inspecting every closet, even lifting up a few loose floorboards, hoping to get his hands on the last pill. But he couldn't find it. Night had already fallen. Matt was about to go back home when he stopped in front of a frame containing a photograph of Elliot, surrounded by several pictures of Angie. Then he gave vent to his anger and disappointment. "You really had us going, didn't you?" he shouted at Elliot's picture. He was yelling as if his friend were in front of him. "It's all a load of crap, isn't it? Tall tales you made up to justify your behavior." He stepped closer to the photograph and stared into the doctor's face. "There never was an old Cambodian. There never were any pills. There never was any time travel. You were crazy 30 years ago, and you stayed crazy until the day you died." In an outburst of fury, he picked up the picture frame and hurled it against the wall. "Bastard!" Then, at the end of his rope, he collapsed in a chair. It took him a long time to calm down. The room was now completely dark. Matt got up to turn on the lamp that stood on a painted wooden chest. He picked Elliot's picture out of the fragments of glass and set it on one of the bookshelves. No odd feelings. Bookshelves. He went over to them. He remembered the day when he had come here to put the telegram between the pages of an atlas. Standing in front of the shelves, he cast his eye over the titles until he found the book he was looking for, blew on the edge to remove the fine layer of dust, and shook it hard. Nothing. Then suddenly, a last flash of inspiration. He grabbed a paper cutter from the desk and inserted it in the narrow space between the binding and the spine of the atlas. He felt some resistance, And then a tiny square of plastic fell to the floor. Matt picked it up, his heart racing. It was a minuscule sealed pouch which he immediately opened, sliding the contents into his palm. Sitting there now was a little golden pill. He tried to keep from getting carried away, but he was overwhelmed by a flood of adrenaline. One last pill. One final journey. Now what should he do? What had Elliot intended when he'd left himself one last chance to go back to the past? And why had he chosen to hide the pill in that spot? Exactly the one hiding place that only Matt could know about. He was pacing the living room, going over the same questions when his cell phone rang. He looked at the screen and recognized the number. Elena? Yes, it's me. I've just read the notebook. She was speaking in a flat voice, trying to hold back waves of fear and emotion. It's a crazy story, Matt. You have to tell me more. Matt didn't know what to say. He closed his eyes and rubbed his eyelids. Of course Elena had trouble believing Elliot's story. How could it be otherwise? How could he ask her to accept this improbable tale when she had never had the least suspicion of the extraordinary drama that had blighted the life of the man she loved? I can't explain right now, Matt answered. Oh, yes, you will explain, Elena retorted. You come barging in on me, force me to stir up memories I spent 30 years burying, and then you run off like a thief? I'm going to bring him back to you, Elena. Who? Elliot. You're crazy, too. Elliot is dead, Matt. Dead! I'm going to bring him back to you, Matt repeated. You have my word. Stop torturing me! Elena screamed and hung up. Matt put the phone back in his pocket and stood by the window. A fine rain lashed the glass, but at last everything seemed clear to him. This last pill was for him. He found a bottle of Perrier in the refrigerator and took a big gulp to wash down the pill. It was done. Too late to turn back. He went back to the living room, sat in a chair, and put his feet up on the desk. Now he only had to wait. But wait for what? Indigestion? Stomach cramps? Or to go back in time 30 years in his turn? He waited and waited. In vain. Frustrated, he went upstairs, rummaged in the bathroom, and found a bottle of sleeping pills. He took 2, went back down to the living room, and stretched out on the couch. He closed his eyes, counted sheep, opened his eyes, changed position, turned off the light, turned it back on. Shit, he said, and jumped to his feet. Too excited to fall asleep, he put on his coat and went out of the house into a freezing downpour. He ran to his car to get out of the rain and roared off. He headed up Fillmore to Lombard Street. It was after midnight in the middle of winter, and the streets were deserted. He'd reached the highest part of Russian Hill, the place where the street plunges down to North Beach in a series of hairpin turns, when sleep hit him like a fist. Pain suddenly radiated through his neck. His mind clouded, and he felt blood pounding at his temples. He lost consciousness and collapsed at the wheel of his car, without even having time to park. The car scraped against the curb, crushed 2 hydrangea bushes, and came to rest against a metal barrier. 1977. When Matt opened his eyes, he was lying face down on one of the curves of Lombard Street. It was deepest night, shrouded in rain and fog. Soaked and shivering, he stood up with difficulty. He looked at his watch, but it had stopped. He looked around for his car. The 4-wheel drive had disappeared. Higher up, on Hyde Street, a drugstore's neon sign was hissing in the rain. He hurried into the store. The place was empty except for an Asian employee arranging soda cans on a shelf. Matt went up to the magazine rack. Feverishly, he picked up a copy of Newsweek. On the cover, Jimmy Carter was smiling awkwardly. The date at the top was February 6th, 1977. He rushed out of the store. The pill had finally worked. This time, he'd gone back to the past, 30 years back. But he knew that these trips in time were brief. He only had a few minutes to find Elliot. He had at first intended to go to the marina, but according to the notebook, during this period, Elliot often worked at night. He took a few seconds to make up his mind. Lenox Hospital was a little less than a mile away as the crow flies. A short distance by car, but a hefty distance on foot. He stood in the middle of the street to try to stop a cab, but all he got were drivers beeping at him angrily, and several splashes that soaked him even more. He finally summoned up his courage and started to jog through the night toward the hospital. He ran up and down the hills of San Francisco, pausing, out of breath, on California Street. With his hands on his knees, gasping, he bitterly regretted not having followed Tiffany's advice to jog daily and lose the extra 20 pounds he was carrying. His coat was now nothing but a gigantic sponge. He left it on the sidewalk. His load lightened. He took off again in the driving rain. He'd rather die of a heart attack than give up so close to his goal. He'd been waiting for this day for 40 years. The day when it was his turn to save Elliot. Finally, he saw the blinking lights of the emergency entrance. He covered the last 100 yards as quickly as he could and pushed open the door as though his life depended on it. "I'm looking for Dr. Elliot Cooper," he said in one great rush. "I beg your pardon?" said the receptionist. "I'm looking for Dr. Elliot Cooper," he repeated more clearly. The young woman graciously handed him a towel so he could dry off while she looked at the schedule. She was about to answer when a nurse spoke first. "Elliot is in the cafeteria," he explained as he bit into a chocolate bar. "But that—" Matt raced across the lobby as the nurse finished his sentence. "Is reserved for the staff." Matt pushed open the double doors to the cafeteria. The place was deserted and dark. The wall clock indicated 2 a.m., and the voice of Nina Simone could be heard faintly from the radio behind the counter. Matt walked to the middle of the row of tables. Leaning against the wall at one end of the room, with his legs stretched out on a bench, Elliot was smoking a cigarette and making notes on medical files. "I see you're still working." Elliot jumped and turned toward the man who had just come in. At first, he didn't recognize him. Then he disregarded the wrinkles, the excess weight, and the thinning hair. 30 years have changed the way I look, haven't they?" said Matt. "Is that you?" Elliot stammered, slowly standing up. "In the flesh." There was a brief hesitation, and then the two men embraced. "Where the hell did you come from?" "From the year of our Lord 2007. "How could you?" "There was one pill left," Matt explained. "So you know everything?" "Yes." "I'm sorry about what happened," Elliot said apologetically. "Don't worry about it." The two men stood looking at each other, simultaneously moved and shy. "How are you in 2007?" Elliot asked, still eager for information about the future. "I'm getting old," Matt answered, with a hint of a smile. "But I'm doing all right." "We still on bad terms?" Matt paused, then looked his friend in the eyes and confessed, "You're dead." The storm raged, silence, and the bittersweet voice of Nina Simone was drowned out by the rain. Unable to utter a word, Elliot blinked and nodded. Matt was going to say something more when a spurt of blood landed on his shirt, and the trembling began to hit his body. "I'm leaving!" he shouted, hanging on to Elliot. Shaking uncontrollably, he convulsed as though his body had suddenly been hit by an electric charge. "I came to save you," he said, straining to get the words out. He was shaking so hard that Elliot helped him sit on the floor. "How do you propose to do that?" he asked, kneeling next to him. "Like this," said Matt. He took the cigarette out of Elliot's mouth and ground it out on the cafeteria floor. Elliot gave his friend a worried look. Matt's neck was rigid, and his limbs were flailing. "You're not the only one who can save lives," he whispered, trying to smile. "If I'm still alive, I'll see you in 2007, Elliot promised. "You better be, old man." 30 years is a long time, said Elliot, and took him by the hand. "Don't worry. It'll go fast." In a few seconds, Matt's breathing grew loud and hoarse. His eyes glazed over, and a spasm distorted his face. He had just enough time to add, "It always goes too fast." And then he disappeared with a cry of pain. Elliot stood up, full of anxiety. Matt's return to the future had been more painful than that of his double. Had he gotten back to the right place? And if so, what kind of shape was he in? As he always did when he was anxious, he reached for his pack of cigarettes and quickly lit one. Despite the downpour, he opened the window and stared in fascination at the torrents of water coming down from the sky. Elliot took all the time in the world to smoke this cigarette. He'd understood Matt's message perfectly. Distracted, hypnotized by the curtain of rain, he thought about the risks his friend had just taken to save his life. "You really impressed me there," he muttered to himself, hoping that merely by willing it, Matt would somehow hear him. He put out his cigarette on the windowsill, threw the pack he just opened into the wastebasket, and left the cafeteria. That was the last cigarette he ever smoked. 2007. It was after 2 a.m., but the lights were still on in Elena's little house. On the desk, between the laptop computer and a mug of cold tea, the notebook with Elliot's story was open at the last page. Sitting at the desk, her eyes sore from crying, Elena was starting to doze off when the Persian cat sleeping on the couch suddenly arched its back, gave an unearthly growl, and ran to hide under a chest of drawers. In an instant, the house started to shake, the walls vibrated, a light bulb exploded, and a vase shattered on the floor. Elena sat up, terrified. There was a low rumble and a hissing sound. Then the notebook disappeared right before her eyes. The vibrations gradually subsided, and the cat slowly crept out of its hiding place and emitted a plaintive meow. Elena was petrified, overwhelmed with emotion. In her mind was a crazy hope. If the notebook no longer existed, then Elliot hadn't written it. And if Elliot hadn't written it, then he was alive. Epilogue. February 2007. "Sir? Are you all right, sir?" When Matt opened his eyes, he found himself collapsed against the steering wheel of his car. 2 cops, one on each side, were banging on the windows, worried about his condition. Matt sat up with difficulty and unlocked the doors. "I'm calling an ambulance," one of the officers said when he saw the blood on Matt's shirt. He was in bad shape. His head was buzzing, and his eardrums felt as though they'd burst, covering his eyes with his hand to protect them from the light. His legs were stiff, as though he'd been asleep for months. The cops were already asking him questions. After crashing through the metal barrier, the car had ended up on the steps running down the steepest street in the city. Matt gave them his license, accepted complete responsibility for the accident, and submitted to an alcohol test, which turned out negative. Having fulfilled his obligations to the police, he left Lombard Street without waiting for the ambulance. Last night's storm had given way to a beautiful morning of wind and sun. Feeling groggy, Matt limped back to the marina. His head was swimming. Right now, he wasn't sure about anything. Had he dreamed his trip back in time? Had he succeeded in saving Elliot? When Matt got to the marina, he pounded on his friend's door like a madman. "Open up, Elliot! Open the goddamn door!" But the house was empty. Time hadn't erased their friendship, but their friendship, it seemed, couldn't erase time. Exhausted and depressed, Matt sank down on the sidewalk in tears. He sat there until a taxi turned the corner of Fillmore and stopped in front of him. Elena got out of the car, her face full of hope. But Matt shook his head, indicating that he'd failed. He hadn't kept his word. He hadn't been able to bring Elliot back. Elena crossed the street and took a few steps toward the beach. The Golden Gate Bridge was very close by, and for the first time she had the courage to look at the accursed place from which she jumped 30 years before. It still had the same fatal allure that made it so fascinating. As though hypnotized by the morning light, Elena walked toward the ocean. A man was strolling along the shore at the edge of the surf. When he turned around, Elena could see his face, and her heart stopped. He was there. That is the end of Will You Be There? It was written by Guillaume Musso, translated by George Holick, and read by John Chancer. This has been an ICES Audiobooks presentation. For further details of our extensive catalog of audiobooks on cassette and CD, please call our free phone number 0800 731 5637.